Now that we have a clear sense of the ideology against which Shelley is defending poetry, and we've looked at Jeremy Bentham's ideas and his followers' ideas regarding utilitarianism and the importance of usefulness, let's look at the defense and follow through Shelley's explanation of why poetry is actually more useful and more beneficial to society than the practice of reason alone. As you go through Shelley's defense, you might find it useful to consult the outline of the defense that I put together and posted on Canvas. It breaks it down by the different sections of his argument and gives page numbers and important quotations from the passages, which will allow you to find the parts that will be most important. Shelley begins by contrasting the reason which has been championed by rational empiricists with the imagination, which has been advanced as the dominant power of perception by romantic poets. He begins this portion of the essay by describing those two classes of mental action. He says, according to one mode of regarding those two classes of mental action, which are called reason and imagination, the former, that is the reason, may be considered as the mind contemplating the relations borne by one thought to another, however produced. So the reason contemplates relations between existing thoughts, however produced. So the reason contemplates thoughts that already exist in your head. And the latter, that would be the imagination, as the mind acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own light, and composing from them, as from elements, other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of his own integrity. Okay, so it's not quite clear exactly what he means by this when he's describing the action of the imagination to compose from them as from elements, but what he's ultimately describing is that this is a creative action. It's taking existing materials and it's creating new materials from them, composing new materials from them. He goes on to say, the one is to the poiein, or the principle of synthesis, and has for its objects those forms which are common to universal nature and existence itself. This would be the imagination, which is creative. This is the root word from which poetry comes, and it means making in Greek. And it accesses universal nature and existence itself. The other is to logozyne, I guess that's how it's pronounced, or principle of analysis, and its action regards the relations of things simply as relations, considering thoughts not in their integral unity, but as the algebraical representations which conduct to certain results. Reason is the enumeration of quantities already known. Imagination is the perception of the values of those qualities both separately and as a whole. Reason respects the differences, and imagination is the similitudes of things. Reason is to the imagination as the instrument to the agent, as the body to the spirit, as the shadow to the substance. So reason is the instrument, imagination is the agent. Reason is the body, imagination is the spirit. Reason is the shadow, imagination is the substance. So he's arguing that imagination ultimately is the superior power. That imagination is essentially creative, and then reason comes along afterwards and manipulates those things that imagination has already created. And then he goes on to talk about the relationship between poetry and the imagination. In order to develop the relationship between poetry and the imagination, Shelley uses an image with which we're already familiar, the Aeolian lyre. This is an image that we saw earlier in a Coleridge poem, and in fact, Coleridge has a poem called The Aeolian Harp, in which he uses an image similar to the one that Shelley employs here. In that poem, he describes the relationship between the poet's imagination and nature as, and what if all animated nature be but organic harps diversely framed, that tremble into thought as o'er them sweeps plastic and vast, one intellectual breeze, at once the soul of each and God of all. In that poem, Coleridge proposes the idea that nature, which he believes that as objects are fixed and dead, as you recall from the Biographia, comes to life as this pantheistic image of God breathes over them life. So God is this breeze that blows over nature as the wind blows over the harp and makes nature come to life. Now, Shelley uses a similar image. The difference here is that the image is not of God as the breeze and nature as the harp, but as the poet as the harp and nature as the breeze. But he has an enhanced version of this harp, which is capable not only of producing sounds in reaction to the breeze of nature, but is also able to innovate upon that sound. Let's start right here and pick up. He says, poetry in a general sense may be defined to be the expression of the imagination. That's going to be an important thing to remember later because it's an expression of the imagination. Poetry literally expresses. It takes the imagination and brings it out. And poetry is connate with the origin of man. Later, Shelley will develop this idea. And the idea behind this is that language is creative when it finds new ways to describe nature. And the original humans, when they first encountered nature, were inevitably creative because they were creating language. They were literally finding new ways to describe nature because there had been no language before. And so humanity's original language was inevitably creative. It was inevitably an expression of the imagination. He goes on to say, man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are driven, like the alternations of an ever-changing wind over an Aeolian lyre, which move it by their motion to ever-changing melody. Man here is the Aeolian lyre, and nature, which manifests as a series of external and internal impressions, become the alternations of an ever-changing wind. So the impressions from nature are the wind blowing over the human Aeolian lyre and move it by their motion to ever-changing melody. And this will be important to remember when we get to the poem Mont Blanc, because Mont Blanc is going to contemplate the relationship between the impressions of external nature and the imagination of the poet. But he goes on to say, but there is a principle within the human being, and perhaps within all sentient beings, which acts otherwise than in the lyre, and produces not melody alone, but harmony by an internal adjustment of sounds or motions thus excited to the impressions which excite them. The idea is that humans are capable not only of reacting passively to the impressions of external nature, but also are able to innovate upon those impressions. It's like riffing upon the tune or improvisational music. The human is able to take the base melody and then create, in addition to it, its own harmony to go along with the bass melody. It is as if the lyre could accommodate its chords to the motions of that which strikes them in a determined proportion of sound, even as the musician can accommodate his voice to the sound of the lyre. So the human has an additional ability to innovate upon the bass melody produced by the impressions of nature, and that innovation is the imagination. At this point, it's helpful to remember that Shelley is a Neoplatonist. In other words, like Keats, and to some extent like Wordsworth, Shelley believes that there exists an order of truth and beauty which supersedes, is beyond the actual world that we observe. And for the Neoplatonist, the poet is able to access this permanent world of truth and beauty through the exercise of the imagination. So the sensory world around the poet provides the melody, and the harmony is produced by the imagination, and the harmony is the thing that accesses this world of permanent truth and beauty. So the poet's creative ability to improvise upon the melody of nature and produce this independent and creative harmony is what gives the poet the power of superseding nature, of surpassing nature, and accessing the realm of the good, the true, and the beautiful in Plato's terms. In other words, the poet's imagination, working from the sensory stimuli provided by nature, the breeze that he describes, is able to innovate or improvise upon that melody provided by nature, and through the power of the imagination is able to surpass the sensory stimuli and reach in through the imagination to the world of permanent truth. And then in the next passage, he explains how savages and primordial humans seek to create a language which describes the external world around them. All of these passages are meant to demonstrate that humans use language to record, express, celebrate, and extend the pleasure that they find in their impressions of the external world. And the following passage then shows how language becomes the basic tissue of society, an idea which will become very important later. He says, "These social sympathies, or those laws from which, as from its elements, society results, begin to develop themselves from the moment that two human beings coexist." Language originates as a way to articulate the impressions created on the individual through nature. But then once two humans coexist, it becomes a way of sharing experiences with others, which develops social sympathies. And you can hear the echoes of Adam Smith and his theory of moral sentiments here. So language not only records the impressions of the senses, but becomes a means of trying to gain the sympathies of others to those impressions. And so language encodes the social fabric of society. The next point that he's going to develop is that once language becomes a social fabric, people start to observe regular patterns in the language produced in response to their impressions from nature. Hence, men, even in the infancy of society, observe a certain order in their words and actions distinct from that of the objects and impressions represented by them, all expression being subject to the laws of that from which it proceeds. So, in other words, what he is saying here is that humans experience the external impressions of nature. They innovate upon those external impressions as the harmony to the melody. In other words, they produce their own impressions in response to the external impressions of nature. And then they begin to observe that in this innovation, in this order created by the imagination, there are certain orders that are recurrent, that come up over and over again. So they observe a certain order in their words and actions. Language recreates a regular order or pattern in recording the productions of the imagination. He will go on to say that there is a certain order or rhythm belonging to each of these classes of mimetic representation from which the hearer and the spectator receive an intenser and purer pleasure than any other. The sense of an approximation to this order has been called taste by modern writers. So, people observe that some of the patterns that come out of the productions of the imagination through language give more pleasure than others. Music as opposed to discordant noise, for example. And the ability to recognize those patterns that produce more pleasure has been called taste. In other words, one has taste when they can recognize those patterns which produce beauty. On the next page, page 873, he says, those people who have the most taste are poets. Those in whom it is taste, exist in excess are poets, in the most universal sense of the word. And the pleasure resulting from the manner in which they express the influence of society or nature upon their own minds communicates itself to others and gathers a sort of reduplication from that community. Their language is vitally metaphorical in that it marks the before unapprehended relations of things and perpetuates their apprehension until the words which represent them become through time signs for portions or classes of thought instead of pictures of integral thoughts. And then if no new poet should arise to create afresh the associations which have been thus disorganized, language will be dead to all the nobler purposes of human intercourse. So poets first are those who are able to produce those kinds of order and expression which produce the most pleasure, and then that pleasure gathers a sort of reduplication from that community. So when they share that with other people, the people together experience this communally, and because the experience of sharing with others is more pleasant than just simply expressing it oneself, a nightingale singing in solitude, an image he uses for the poet later, is not the ultimate fulfillment of art. The community built around the expression becomes itself enhanced by that expression. And he goes on to say their language is vitally metaphorical because it reflects these new orders that the poet has detected and has been able to express. But once those new orders become familiar over time and become cliches, they start to die. In order to understand what Shelley means when he says that the language of poets is vitally metaphorical and marks the before unapprehended relations between things and thus is able to rejuvenate language and keep it from dying, it's helpful to understand what a metaphor is and how a metaphor works. Now, we use metaphors all the time. Everyone in everyday life uses metaphors all the time without really even thinking about it. But metaphors have a way of creating new associations within language. A metaphor, in its most basic definition, is an implicit comparison between two objects. And the reason we understand a metaphor as a metaphor is because were we to take it in its literal sense, it wouldn't make any sense. So, for example, if I were to say, my sister is a pig, there are two ways you could understand this. One is, I am biologically related to a porcine four-legged farm animal. Or you could understand this as a metaphor, which means I am making an implicit comparison between the behavior of my sister and the supposed behavior of pigs. Now, because it is biologically impossible for me to be related to an actual pig, and please keep your observations about my personality to yourself, you understand that that meaning is nonsensical and that my sister cannot actually be a four-legged farm animal. And therefore you understand it to be a metaphor and interpret the meaning that I intend rather than the meaning that the sentence seems to say. The reason that this can be so creative is that very often metaphors draw comparisons between two things that have not normally been associated and shows how two things that are very different turn out to be similar in some way. This is the basis of metaphysical poetry, the Jacobean period poetry coming from the early 1700s, written by poets like John Donne and George Herbert, which uses their poetry to draw implicit but very unlikely comparisons between two objects. What Samuel Johnson in the 18th century called yoking heterogeneous objects by violence together. But once they draw the comparison, the reader is supposed to look at that and say, of course, I never saw that relationship before. So metaphors can be very creative in that they are able to show language new ways of looking at the relationship between things. Now, according to literary philosopher and linguist I.A. Richards, who also, by the way, wrote a book on the meaning of imagination in Coleridge, a metaphor has two components. A vehicle, which is the image or word itself. So the word pig in the previous example would be the vehicle. It's the word that carries the meaning. And then the tenor is the intended meaning that is being conveyed through the comparison. So when I say my sister is a pig is the vehicle. Tenor is has sloppy and messy habits. Now, what can happen to metaphors over time is they can become very overused. They can become very familiar. They can become cliche. And if that happens often enough, what one gets is a dead metaphor. A dead metaphor is a metaphor the original meaning has been lost and the tenor has become the primary meaning. In other words, the metaphor literally dies. It ceases to be a comparison between two objects and its meaning simply becomes the meaning that was intended. So, for example, the word ruminate originally meant to chew slowly. Cows, for example, are animals that are called ruminants because they have a stomach called a rumen, R-U-M-E-N, and they can regurgitate their cud from the rumen, which they then chew in order to extract maximum nutritional value from it. To ruminate means simply to chew slowly originally. But now that meaning has been lost. In fact, most people probably would not be aware of that. And now the metaphorical meaning, which means to ponder or think over carefully, has become the actual definition, denotation of the word. So, in a sense, the metaphor, the language, has died, and the job of the poet, according to Shelley, is to discover new and before unapprehended relationships between things, and therefore rejuvenate language, make it fresh and new again. So, to sum up Shelley's argument to this point, The imagination is that power which perceives the impressions created by nature and then is able to produce connections. It's able to perceive the connections between different things. And by perceiving those connections is able to intuit the higher order, which later reason then comes along and manipulates and plays with. But imagination is the creative power which intuits this higher order and brings it down to humans. To the extent that this higher order gets lost through familiarity, language dies. Poets can then re-enliven language through their ability to perceive connections which they express through metaphorical expressions. Shelley then goes on to claim that the ability to perceive the connection between things and to intuit the order by which things are organized is the ability to perceive the Platonic ideal world. He says, in the infancy of society, every author is necessarily a poet because language itself is poetry, and to be a poet is to apprehend the true, the beautiful, and a word, the good, which exists in the relations subsisting first between existence and perception, and secondly, between perception and expression. So you'll notice that he's making use of the Platonic connection of the good, the true, and the beautiful. And he says that people in the origins of society are expressing new perceptions of order which did not before exist. And therefore, language is always creative. It's always poetry. But then eventually it can die unless poets exist to re-enliven it by bringing it back to that original and essential order. And he goes on to say, and this is an important passage, that in this larger sense of perceiving and expressing this order, poets are not just writers in language or even just artists. He says, looking right here, but poets, or those who imagine and express this indestructible order, are not only authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and painting, they're instructors of laws and the founders of civil society and the inventors of arts and the teachers who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true, that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world which is called religion. So, poets in the larger sense are anyone who is able to express this indestructible order not only through traditional forms of art, but also through anything which orders our society, which reflects the essential and original order in the construction of society, which would certainly include not only artists, but also institutors of laws, but also the founders of civil society and the inventors of the arts and the teachers and those who manifest religion. So all of those people in this sense are artists. And this is the point that Shelley is building up to. This is his big coda for this section. Poets, according to the circumstances of the age and nation in which they appeared, were called in the earlier epochs of the world legislators or prophets. A poet essentially comprises and unites both these characters, for he not only beholds intensely the present as it is and discovers those laws according to which present things ought to be ordered, but he beholds the future in the present, and his thoughts are the germs of the flower and the fruit of the latest time. A poet participates in the eternal, the infinite, and the one. As far as it relates to his conceptions, time and place and number or not. So this is the Neoplatonic moment in Shelley's thought. The poet is someone who participates in the eternal order and brings it down and expresses it not only through language, but through all of those institutions which reflect this eternal order in human society. On the next page, Shelley is going to go on to argue that the poets who write in language are actually the most true poets, because their language is a direct expression of thought, whereas other forms of art are mediated and therefore are bound by the limitations of their media. A modern linguist would claim that poets are also bound by the limitations of their medium, language, but Shelley is making grand claims for the poet here. He says, but poetry in a more restrictive sense expresses those arrangements of language. So he's going to now limit it to what we think of as poetry and language, and especially metrical language, which are created by that imperial faculty whose throne is curtained within the invisible nature of man. In other words, poetry is a direct expression of the product of the imagination. And this springs from the nature itself of language, which is a more direct representation of the actions and passions of our internal being. Doesn't this sound a lot like Wordsworth, using rural language because it is a less mediated expression of emotion, and is susceptible of more various and delicate combinations in color, form, or motion, and is more plastic and obedient to the control of that faculty of which it is the creation. For language is arbitrarily produced by the imagination and has relation to thoughts alone, but all the other materials, instruments, and conditions of art have relations among each other which limit and interpose between conception and expression. The former is as a mirror which reflects, the latter is a cloud which enfeebles, the light of which are both the mediums of communication. So in other words, he's going to argue that of all the poets, legislators and priests and architects and sculptors and musicians and composers and all of the poets, the truest poet, the one whose imagination is most clearly expressed through his medium, is the poet who writes in language. For most of the next 2 pages, Shelley is going to provide examples of great poets, and he's also going to then limit his definition of what a poem is, as opposed to prose. It's interesting to look at this, especially in relation to Coleridge's similar discussion in the Biographia, but because we don't have time, we are going to simply skip over it and move on to the next argument that he makes. And this is, on page 876, his discussion of the social effects of poetry. Remember that Shelley is making this argument in order to prove the utility of poetry. He wants to prove that poetry is useful and beneficial in response to the utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham, who claim that poetry is a waste of time, that it serves no function. And so he started out his argument by pointing out that poetry in the larger sense relates to the ability to capture truth, to pierce beyond the actual, and to capture the before unapprehended relations between things. So poetry is the medium that keeps society alive. In that argument, he has also made a connection between poetry and society. You'll remember back on page 872 that he had connected language and the social sympathies together, so that language is a way that we can share our perception of the power of the imagination to enliven nature. And that connection, the connection between language and poetry and social sympathy, is the one that he will build on in the next section. He begins by explaining that he is going to proceed to estimate the effects upon society, the effects of poetry on society. And he begins by talking about the nightingale in solitude in a fairly famous passage that you're likely to see again. In fact, this may be one of the most famous passages of the defense, along with one that we'll look at later where he calls the poets the unacknowledged legislators of the world, and also along with the fading coal passage. He says, "A poet is a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude with sweet sounds." And so in his characterization of the poet is not doing this specifically for social purposes, but nevertheless, the poet's song becomes something that benefits society. His auditors are as men entranced by the melody of an unseen musician who feel they are moved and softened, yet not know whence or why. So the benefit of the poet's production is that it moves and softens its auditors. So even though the poet is not writing specifically for a pedagogical purpose, is not writing to move an audience specifically, because that would be rhetoric, which is not poetry according to Shelley, nevertheless, it has the effect of softening its hearers. He goes on to talk about the fact that many people will object that poetry often presents us with immoral people, and so he is addressing the argument that poetry teaches by giving us examples of proper morality, which of course is not the purpose. The purpose is not simply to offer us tales that are moral fables, which are supposed to give us lessons about how to behave. So therefore, it's not a worthy objection that the characters are remote from moral perfection, nor let it be objected that these characters are remote from moral perfection, and that they can by no means be considered as edifying patterns for general imitation. He explains that every period of time has its particular social flaws, and it's very possible that Homer's heroes, Achilles, Hector, and Ulysses, exhibit personality traits which should not be emulated. But that's not how poetry works, according to Shelley. If we scroll down to the next page, he offers another very famous passage, which you are likely to see again, both in this class, there's a hint there about the midterm, and also in other classes. But poetry acts in another and diviner manner. It awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world and makes familiar objects be as if they were not familiar. It reproduces all that it represents, and the impersonations clothed in its Elysian light stand thenceforward in the minds of those who have once contemplated them as memorials of that gentle and exalted content which extends itself over all thoughts and over all actions with which it coexists. The first part of this passage echoes something that was said by Wordsworth and Coleridge, which is poetry takes the familiar, the customary, those things we're used to, and makes them unfamiliar so that we can see them again. But it has another advantage, and another more immediate utilitarian advantage. He says, the great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our own nature and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, and person not our own. Basically, he's describing what might be described as empathy. Identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, and person not our own. A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. The pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers the effect by acting on the cause. And you should be hearing in this Adam Smith's theory of moral sentiments, his explanation that our ability to imaginatively put ourselves in the position of other people and to imagine what we would feel were we in their position is what builds sympathy with other people, and that sympathy becomes the basis of morality. It allows the pleasures and pains of his species to become his own. It allows him to sympathize with others of his species, and of other species, I suppose, as well. The great instrument of moral good is the imagination, because the imagination is the faculty that allows us to put ourselves in the place of others. And poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. It administers to our ability to sympathize by acting upon the cause of that ability, which is the imagination. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight, which have the power of attracting and assimilating to their own nature all other thoughts, and which form new intervals and interstices whose void forever craves fresh food. Poetry strengthens that faculty which is the organ of the moral nature of man, in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. So just as working out builds muscles, working out your imagination builds your imagination and increases your ability to sympathize. The utility of poetry is that it makes us more sympathetic and therefore better humans. And you should clearly hear in this not only echoes of Adam Smith, but also echoes of Wordsworth and the discussion we had about Tintern Abbey and the fact that Wordsworth is able to hear in nature and the language of the sense the still sad music of humanity, which becomes the nurse, the guide, the guardian of his heart and soul of all his moral being. If you scroll down to page 878, I have added 2 paragraphs to back into the defense that the editors of the Norton Anthology have left out. And those are the 2 paragraphs that appear just exactly where these 3 asterisks are, just above this paragraph. And this is important because this allows you to see that Shelley is actually responding directly to Bentham and Bentham's followers' attacks on poetry by claiming that poetry satisfies a higher form of utility. And in this, he characterizes those people who claim that utility simply means satisfying our animal desires, our desire for food. He starts off by saying, but poets have been challenged to resign the civic crown to reasoners and mechanists on another plea. It is admitted that the exercise of the imagination is most delightful, but it is alleged that that of reason is more useful. And so the argument that Bentham and his followers are making is, sure, poetry is a lot of fun, but it doesn't really do anything. It isn't helpful. And so he's going to examine as the grounds of this distinction what is here meant by utility. The utilitarians define good as anything which contributes to the happiness of mankind, and bad as anything which detracts from that happiness or causes pain. But very often those following Bentham mean that pleasure and pain in a physical sense. They're not referring to higher pleasures, something that John Stuart Mill will respond to in his own conception of utility later. The followers of utility often define pleasure in the sense of mere physical pleasures of the body and comforts of the body, and pain as suffering, physical suffering. They do not account for higher forms of pleasure very often. Percy Bysshe Shelley is anticipating here Mill's response to some extent by claiming that there are higher forms of pleasure as well. Pleasure or good in a general sense is that which the consciousness of a sensitive and intelligent being seeks, and in which, when found, it acquiesces. This will be John Stuart Mill's argument later as well, many years later in 1870s. There are two kinds of pleasure, one durable, universal and permanent, the other transitory and particular. Utility may either express the means of producing the former or the latter. In the former sense, whatever strengthens and purifies the affections, enlarges the imaginations, and adds spirits to sense is useful. But a narrower meaning may be assigned to the word utility, confining it to express that which banishes the importunity of the wants of our animal nature, the surrounding men with security of life, the dispersing of grosser delusions of superstition, and the conciliating such a degree of mutual forbearance among men as may consist with the motives of personal advantage. So he is contrasting two definitions of utility. The first definition is the higher powers, and the second definition are the lower physical kinds of utility, that which banishes the importunity of the wants of our animal nature, the desire for food, the desire for sleep, for example, providing of security, the banishing of silly superstitions that get in the way of happiness. Then he accuses the followers of Bentham, the utilitarians, of giving priority to the lower forms. Undoubtedly, the promoters of utility in this limited sense have their appointed office in society. They follow the footsteps of poets and copy the sketches of their creations into the Book of Common Life. They make space and give time. Their exertions are of the highest value so long as they confine their administration of the concerns of inferior powers of our nature with the limits due to the superior ones. He says they're useful. They implement the realities that the poet sees. Their exertions are valuable so long as they don't leave their lane. The problem is when they start to attack the poets, when they start to attack the people who provide the insight into the nature of truth that are useful to point out the better way, which guide those who are attempting to create the lower form of pleasure. He argues that those people who are simply focused on creating physical pleasure have allowed the rich to become richer and the poor to become poorer, and the vessel of the state is driven between the Scylla and Charybdis of anarchy and despotism. Such are the effects which must ever flow from the unmitigated exercise of the calculating faculty. And this is rationalism to reason. If we go back to the Norton Anthology selection, he points out that unlike Bentham's philosophers, the production and assurance of pleasure in this highest sense is the true utility. Those who produce and preserve this pleasure are poets, or poetical philosophers. So why is it important that we pay attention to this higher form of pleasure as the true utility and listen to the poets or poetical philosophers who are the producers of this true utility by creating this higher form of pleasure? If you scroll down to page 879, he describes the problem of mere factual and rational knowledge without the higher form of knowledge produced by poets and poetic philosophers. He's describing what happens when, for example, science runs amok because it isn't controlled by morality. He says, we want means we lack the creative faculty to imagine that which we know, We want, again, we lack the generous impulse to act that which we imagine. We want the poetry of life. Our calculations have outrun conception. We have eaten more than we can digest. The cultivation of those sciences which have enlarged the limits of the empire of man over the external world has, for one of the poetical faculty, proportionally circumscribed those of the internal world, and man, having enslaved the elements, remains himself a slave. That's really interesting when you think that this was written at the beginning of the 1800s, before the Manhattan Project and before the development of global climate change. And he's describing the fact that we have science lacking moral guidance. He will go on to say, the functions of the poetical faculty are twofold. By one, it creates new materials of knowledge and power and pleasure. By the other, it engenders in the mind a desire to reproduce and arrange them according to a certain rhythm and order which may be called the beautiful and the good. So in other words, poetry captures and reproduces the Platonic order, the order of the beautiful and the good in our world. The cultivation of poetry is never more to be desired than at periods when, from an excess of the selfish and calculating principle, the accumulation of the materials of external life exceed the quantity of power of assimilating them into the internal laws of human nature. The body has then become too unwieldy for that which animates it. Poetry is indeed something divine. It is at once the center and circumference of all knowledge. It is that which comprehends all science, and that to which all science must be referred. So poetry gives us the higher sympathies which allow us to understand and manipulate the world over which we have gained control through science. And in that sense, Shelley would argue that poetry has its true utility by creating and enlarging our moral sense. The rest of the defense is largely a celebration of the powers of poetry, enlarging upon and repeating what Shelley has already claimed about its ability to enliven the world and to guide our knowledge. I do want to call your attention to one important passage before we move away from the defense, which is the famous Fading Coal passage on page 880. And this is going to be important in order to not only understand something about how the Romantics conceive of the imagination, but also to understand the poem Mont Blanc. He says, starting on this line, "Poetry is not like reasoning, a power to be exerted according to the determination of the will. A man cannot say, 'I will compose poetry.' The greatest poet even cannot say it, for the mind in creation is as a fading coal, which some invisible influence, like an inconstant wind, awakens to transitory brightness. This power arises from within, like the color of a flower which fades and changes as it is developed. And the conscious portions of our nature are unprophetic either of its approach or its departure. Could this influence be durable in its original purity and force, it's impossible to predict the greatness of the results. But when composition begins, inspiration is already on the decline, and the most glorious poetry that has ever been communicated to the world is probably a feeble shadow of the original conception of the poet." This is similar to Wordsworth's description of the spontaneous overflow of the imagination, during which the poet contemplates a previous emotion until emotion similar to that which was before the subject of contemplation does actually exist in the mind, and in a state of mind similar to this, composition begins, and in a state similar to that it is carried on. So Shelley agrees with Wordsworth that poetry is this moment of inspiration, and that the poet rushes to record as much of this inspiration into written poetry as he can before it fades away, as a coal burns out once it's been blown into brightness by a passing breeze. And as he says, when composition begins, inspiration is already on the decline. Like Coleridge and like Wordsworth, poetry is the moment of inspiration, and the poem is the secondary product of that inspiration. So Shelley is arguing that poetry actually produces a higher form of utility than that endorsed by Bentham and his followers. They support mere physical utility, the alleviation of suffering, the feeding of stomachs, the warmth of clothing. Shelley, on the other hand, claims that there's a higher form of utility that is achieved by poetry, which is the discovery of moral order and the understanding of the world. Something, as Wordsworth might have said, comes from his relationship with nature. It allows them to see into the hidden beauty of the world, to see into the life of things. At the end of the defense, Shelley leaves us with another one of his famous passages. And he says, starting right here, "It is impossible to read the compositions of the most celebrated writers of the present day without being startled with the electric life which burns within their words. They measure the circumference and sound the depths of human nature with a comprehensive and all-penetrating spirit, and they are themselves perhaps the most sincerely astonished at its manifestations, for it is less their spirit than the spirit of the age. Poets are the hierophants of unapprehended inspiration, the mirrors of the gigantic shadows which futurity casts upon the present, the words which express what they understand not, the trumpets which sing to battle and feel not what they inspire, the influence which is moved not but moves. Poets are the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Far from being useless and proponents of a game like tiddlywinks, as Bentham called it, poetry is like pushpin. Poets are actually the most important people. They are the architects, the religious leaders, the legislators. He says that they are ultimately the unacknowledged legislators of the world. Now, Shelley provides us with a fitting point to make the transition to Victorianism. And it's useful to keep in mind what Shelley is doing here, because he is responding to a central argument that is going to take over the 19th century. The argument of the philosophical radicals who are seeking to improve society by decreasing the amount of suffering and increasing the amount of pleasure, which is a noble goal, but they're doing it in ways that discount the powers of the imagination, as John Stuart Mill himself will recognize and will describe in his 5th chapter of his autobiography that we'll be looking at. This is a good transition point in order to move into the Victorian era, because it not only summarizes the arguments that came from Wordsworth and Coleridge and others about the value of poetry from the Romantic point of view, but it also points that value toward the argument that's going to be made against literature later in the 19th century.